This episode and others like it has been brought to you by Patreon. Shout out to my contributors, the names of which are on screen. Your gratuity is greatly appreciated. If you enjoy this content, consider donating to my Patreon for as little as $2 per month. Thanks again, and on to the video. In the last video on the subject, we covered the true motivations of the Founding Fathers when they set about building this nation. In this episode, we'll be taking a deeper dive into the various means of legal control used by the ruling class to subvert and tailor the democratic process in a way to which the outcomes are always in their favor. The legal anti-democratic levers are as follows: the Electoral College, superdelegates, voter suppression, the Supreme Court, and the so-called deep state, and the inherently insular nature of our political system at large. We shall be reviewing all of these in detail. Number 1. The Electoral College. The Electoral College is a series of delegates which are distributed across the country from state to state, which vote on behalf of various blocks and districts. During the general election, voters don't vote for the presidents, they vote for an elector who votes on their behalf. And the real winner of the race is the first candidate to reach 270 Electoral College votes. The Electoral College is a winner-take-all system, so the person who secures the most college votes within a given state secures all of the votes within said state. More so than that, due to the way that the colleges are distributed across the country, rural voters and swing state voters have the upper hand when it comes to influencing the ultimate outcome of the election. For example, if we were to take a solid blue state like California with a population of roughly 39.5 million and 55 college votes, and compare that to a swing state like Wisconsin with a population of 5.8 million and 11 college votes, despite having 7 times the population, Californian voters only have 73% of the voting power that Wisconsin voters do, while Wisconsin voters, on the other hand, have approximately 1.4 times the voting power versus Californians. In other words, one Wisconsin vote is worth 1.4 Californian votes, and one Californian vote is worth 0.73 Wisconsin votes. Why is this a problem? Because for one, it's a winner-take-all system, and for two, if you give smaller sects of the population a greater deal of influence over the election, all the candidates have to do is pander to that specific demographic to win. In this way, presidential candidates can center their campaigns around the Rust Belt and swing states, effectively gaming the college by playing the popularity contest in these regions to the best of their abilities.
The political establishment has brought about the destruction of our factories and our jobs as they flee to Mexico, China, and other countries all around the world. It's a global power structure that is responsible for the economic decisions that have robbed our working class, stripped our country of its wealth, and put that money into the pockets of a handful of large corporations and political entities.
For this reason, it is possible for a presidential candidate to win the election via the college despite losing the popular vote by a factor of millions. As a result, the system has a tendency of biasing the ultimate outcome in the favor of the more reactionary candidate, as 2 out of the 3 most recent Republican presidents failed to secure the popular vote, but would go on to win anyways thanks to the Electoral College. This system also has the effect of making it so that people are forced to constantly choose between the lesser of 2 evils. Unlike under a ranked choice voting system, by which the constituency rank their most preferred candidate to their least from a list of possible electees without risk of slanting the election in the favor of the more reactionary candidates, under our current first-past-the-post winner-take-all type system, people cannot afford to vote for a third-party candidate since in doing so, they risk splitting the vote with the Democrat and inadvertently handing the election over to the Republicans. And so as a result, much like a bad hostage situation, the current system compels working-class voters to act in the moment and choose their candidates based on fear rather than their rational class interest. The tautological psychology of it goes something like this. Third-party candidates cannot win because they don't have the support, and they don't have the support because they cannot win. And so, because of this defeatist circular reasoning that is perpetually reinforced by the current political atmosphere, people can't see the forest for the trees. They don't understand that the valid third-party alternative won't just build itself and actually requires their active participation in order to do so. But then if they did that, people would have to spend more than just a few months every 4 years caring about politics. They would actually have to do the political struggle themselves instead of simply passing on that responsibility onto others. Because of now, it stands to reason that most Americans either simply aren't ready to take politics seriously, or they don't know how to play politics in the first place, or the system has done such an effective job at browbeating, gaslighting, and terrorizing everyone that they don't even have the will to try. Number 2. Delegates and superdelegates. Prior to the general election, both the Republican and Democratic parties host what are known as primary elections, a kind of presidential election before the presidential election by which both parties nominate their desired candidate. During primary season, candidates under each party campaign across the country, competing with one another for a finite number of delegate votes, which, like the Electoral College, represents individual constituency districts. During the 2020 Democratic primary, there were a total of 4,750 delegates. Of this number, 771 of them, or about 16% of the total delegates, were superdelegates. Unlike the Electoral College, or the standard delegates, the superdelegates are not beholden to the voting constituency, and they don't vote on behalf of said constituency, but the Democratic establishment as a whole. Basically, they side with whoever the Democratic establishment's favorite candidate might be, and since they constitute such a large part of the delegates overall, they can effectively override the primary outcome in the favor of their predetermined establishment candidate. If, say, in 2016, Bernie Sanders secured the greatest number of delegates in the primary over Hillary Clinton, at the Democratic National Convention, the superdelegates could have just sided with Clinton and made her the nominee anyways despite not securing the popular vote, thereby thwarting and subverting the Democratic will of the majority. Keep in mind that there are no superdelegates in the Republican Party. They only exist in what is supposed to be the mainstream American left party. And thus, they keep these left-wing candidates around on a leash, rat-fucking the primary in a dozen different ways from Sunday as to tailor the final result to keep the left-wing candidate from winning. And then immediately afterwards, the countrywide Democratic partisan gaslighting campaign starts. You get told by everyone in the Democratic establishments, including the very left-wing candidate who is supposed to represent you, the very left-wing candidate who postured themselves as being the start of a political revolution, that you need to suck it up and Pokemon Go to the polls and vote for the people who fucked you over in the first place, lest the big, bad, evil Republicans win. Nothing about this is democratic at all. Moving on. Number 3. Voter suppression. On a more localized level, we have varying degrees of direct voter suppression. So we've reviewed the Electoral College and the superdelegates, which both work to directly subvert the popular will, and on top of that, we also have a slew of arbitrary laws and restrictions in various parts of the country which are designed in an incredibly transparent way to drive down voter turnout as much as possible, which by extension biases the election in the favor of the more reactionary candidate because naturally, most people are repulsed by your average Republican, and the lower you can drive the voter turnout, the more likely you can make it that the right-wing candidate will win. Some of these levers include, but are not limited to, Number 1. Closed primaries. In a closed primary, a Republican can't cross over to vote for a Democratic candidate, directly shutting down and reducing voter turnout. I personally know a number of right-wingers who attested to turning out and voting for Bernie Sanders back in 2016 because despite disagreeing with his politics, they understood that he's more sincerely representing their interests than anybody else in mainstream US political discourse at the time. In fact, I remember when they used to conduct polls between Sanders versus Trump in a potential general election matchup, that Sanders averaged colossal leads over Trump ranging from 10 all the way up to 15 percentage points, with a significant chunk of that crossover coming from the Republican voter base. As it turns out, when you have a candidate who actually stands for something, it isn't just trying to manipulate people for their vote, said candidate will attract support from all aisles of the political spectrum. And so to keep this from happening, the people who run the electoral system, whom coincidentally also run the Democratic Party and operate the news media from the shadows, have to resort to closing primaries across dozens of states to prevent said crossover support from taking place. Number 2. Voter ID laws. Voter ID laws could be considered by some as a callback to the early days of the United States, back when most were barred from voting due to property qualifications. Basically, it means you need a driver's license to vote in a given state and election. This is done with the guise of wanting more secure and valid elections, but in practice, all it does is keep poor people and minorities from being able to participate, since said demographics overwhelmingly vote left-wing when given the chance. Number 3. Ballot dumping. Also known as purging voters off the rolls. What this entails is taking the ballot boxes in a given state or district and throwing them in the garbage. According to a report from the Brennan Center, between 4 million people had their votes purged between 2014 and 2016, as well as 2006 and 2008 during general elections. In Florida, between 2016 and 2018, as much as 7% of voters participating in elections were purged from the rolls. Number 4. Closed polling places and narrowing the hours of voting. Essentially, it entails having as few voting booths as open as possible in an attempt to bottleneck the constituency. In the information age, you'd think we could relegate voting for a politician or a bill to an app on our smartphones. But nope, we still have to do things the medieval way and show up in person in order to vote on clunky, primitive ballot machines with incredibly poor operational security, with nefariously coded code designed to flip votes. But we'll get to that in a moment. Back in 2016, during the Democratic primary between Sanders and Clinton, I remember watching on the news that in Minnesota, they were shutting down polling places left and right, so much so to where there were massive lines of people waiting for up to 10 to 12 hours at a time to cast their vote for Bernie Sanders. And in the end, they closed the primary prematurely while there were still loads of people waiting to vote outside. Calling the state in favor of Hillary Clinton, of course. Number 5. Deliberate electoral fraud. Granted that this isn't technically legal, it's what could be classified as extra-legal, but it does constitute an essential aspect of our democracy, quote-unquote. Electoral fraud is not a conspiracy theory, but a well-documented phenomenon across virtually every presidential election since the 1960s. Huge discrepancies have been documented between the reported vote counts on the machines and the unadjusted exit polls. That is, the polling data which is taken when people are asked who they voted for as they leave the voting booths. TDMS research has logged numerous occasions of such discrepancies. For example, during the 2020 California primary, exit polls had Sanders holding 38% of the vote, Biden with 23%, and Bloomberg with 11%. However, the reported vote counts had Sanders down to 33.8%, Biden at 26.5%, and Bloomberg at 13.5%. Similar discrepancies, which were coincidentally always biased in the favor of the establishment candidates, had also been documented in a dozen other states throughout the primary as well, from Michigan to Missouri to Vermont to Massachusetts to Illinois to California and so on. Once again, every time, in each case, the numbers always improved in the direction of Biden and Bloomberg and against Bernie Sanders. And this ballot box rigging, by the way, has transpired heavily during the 2016 primary as well. What you are seeing on screen right now is a list of data compiled by TDMS Research showcasing the huge documentable discrepancies between the unadjusted exit polls and the final result of each respective primary. Notice how the numbers seemingly always improve in the favor of the most reactionary candidates. Think about it, people. Does it really make any sort of sense at all that Bernie Sanders, the guy who was selling out entire stadiums full of tens of thousands of energized and enthusiastic supporters at his campaign rallies, was genuinely failing to generate more committed voter turnout than Hillary Clinton, the candidate whom at the exact same time was struggling to fill high school gymnasiums worth of support, the candidate who is on record for being among the most hated and corrupt politicians in the country, the candidate who has decades of controversy and political baggage surrounding their name? Hell, Sleepy Joe Biden won the election from the safety of his bedroom. He didn't even have campaign offices in any of the states that he won in, and you expect me to believe that the reported results stand on their own merit? Especially when you consider how dated our digital voting booths are, and how all it takes is a 5th grader level science education to hack them from a remote location, or recode them to flip votes periodically, or count votes for one candidate as fractions of a vote, directly tampering with the results. In the next video of this series, I shall be reviewing the fraudulent nature of our democracy in detail, using the 2016 Democratic primary as our main case study, presenting a multitude of well-documented instances of deliberate acts of nefarious rigging transpiring across 18 different states, debunking some of the common arguments made by status quo stooges against the notion of electoral fraud, and then finishing by explaining the real reason why after the 2016 Democratic primary, Rachel Maddow and the rest of the Democratic establishment liberal talking heads spent years upon years peddling the Russiagate conspiracy theory. Spoiler alert, it was a psyop to distract from the real electoral robbery transpiring before our very eyes. Number 4. The Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is a legal body comprising 9 unelected judges whom constitute an additional anti-democratic fail-safe at times when need be. They serve no term limits, they're handpicked by the President and confirmed by the Senate, they aren't held to any sort of democratic accountability, and they have the power to invoke the Constitution as to shut down any and all legislation that they don't like. In theory, you could have the President, the House, and the Senate behind a popular bill, and the justices could simply rule it as unconstitutional and kill it in the water on the spot. As of last year, in these past couple of months, the Supreme Court has launched an assault on hard-earned concessions fought for and won by workers, effectively rolling the clocks back on civil rights, workers' rights, environmental protections, and popular reforms alike. For example, when Biden made recommendations through OSHA to push for a soft vaccine mandate, even though said mandate was quite popular, the Supreme Court was able to invoke the Constitution and shut it down, effectively gutting OSHA's ability to perform basic governmental functions in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And just recently, they have also made a similar ruling against the EPA, effectively castrating the Environmental Protection Agency's ability to enforce regulations centered around curtailing CO2 emissions in the coal industry while providing subsidies towards carbon-neutral renewables. And as we all know, they have recently terminated Roe v. Wade for similar reasons, effectively giving the states and local government bodies the right to take away the right of women at will. And they don't plan on stopping with abortion rights either, as ancient, decrepit Supreme Court Justice scumbag Clarence Thomas has recently stated that he wants the court to revisit gay marriage and all forms of contraception as well. In other words, Roe v. Wade is only the beginning of a string of crucial civil rights legislation which the SCOTUS plan on arbitrarily ruling unconstitutional and axing. And while the Supreme Court's excuse for these rulings is the Constitution and states' rights and autonomy, it's pretty clear that they are more than willing to violate their own principles and throw the states' rights excuse out the window when it comes to ruling against states-level legislation that they disagree with, such as was the case with their recent ruling against New York's gun safety laws on top of their ruling in favor of making it more difficult for victims of police violence to sue the cops over police brutality. In the wake of the Supreme Court's reactionary assault on civil rights and environmental protection, what is it that Joe Biden, the democratically elected leader of the United States of America, plan to do about it? Is he going to audit the Supreme Court? Will he pack it with additional left-wing judges as to outweigh their rulings? Does he plan on punishing them by defunding them? Will he codify Roe v. Wade? Does he plan on adding an amendment to the Constitution guaranteeing women a right to an abortion as well as protecting the rights of minorities in the LGBT community? What has the harm reduction candidate Joe Biden opted to do in response to the recent actions of the Supreme Court? The answer? Not a goddamn thing! And why would he? Just like the Supreme Court, he too is an 80-year-old, right-wing, decrepit vampire who was pro-segregationist in the 70s, who was anti-abortion at that time, and has only recently come out in favor of civil rights out of sheer political convenience. If Biden really gave a shit, he would be doing something about it. But he's not, because behind closed doors, regardless of what his stated public opinion might be, in his private opinion, in his actual opinion, he, in all likelihood, agrees with them because he had the same politics as they do now 50 years ago, and he likely still has them now. And to add insult to injury, the majority of the Supreme Court justices alive today have been handpicked by presidents whom have lost the popular vote in years past. 3 from Trump and 2 from George Bush. To add further insult to injury, They even have the power to throw out election results if they don't like the suspected outcome, such as in 2000 when Al Gore won the popular vote and post-election recounts actually had Gore winning Florida. The Supreme Court effectively dumped the ballots by ruling in favor of George Bush, handing him the election on a silver platter. Keep this in mind next time we have a Stop the Steal type riot on Capitol Hill. When push comes to shove, America is incredibly vulnerable to fascist coup and takeover. More about that in the next video. Number 5. The insular and/or pay-to-play nature of our political system itself. In 1987, the Commission on Presidential Debates was founded, which, mind you, is not an extension of the United States government. It is a privately funded, bipartisan, non-profit corporation which exists for the purpose of hosting the national presidential debates on one hand, while explicitly narrowing the discourse and gatekeeping third-party candidates out of the platform on the other. During a press conference held in 1987, Frank Fahrenkopf, the founder of the CPD, stated that they were not likely or willing to include third-party candidates at the debate stage. In fact, in the year 2000, they established a new rule which stated that third parties must secure at least 15% support across 5 national polls of the CPD's own choosing before said third-party candidates are allowed to participate in national debates. Because of this, third-party candidates are never given a platform to make a case for their agenda or their policy positions and are stuck hosting their own debates separately. Since 1988, all the way up to the present, the CPD has been sponsoring all of the national presidential debates during the general elections between the Republican and Democratic candidates. They choose the questions, the parties which are involved, they regulate the platform, dictating the acceptable realm of discussion, and they make all of the rules, and anybody alien to the two-party duopoly has no choice but to play by said rules if they even want a chance of having a seat at the table. But if third-party candidates are denied the advertising or media exposure needed to meet the 15% threshold, how are they ever supposed to meaningfully compete in the national election? The answer is that they're not, and that's the point. It is a closed system by design, and the aspect of campaign financing only adds an additional layer to the problem. It's no secret that lobbying transpires in Washington to the tune of billions of dollars per year. Politicians take legal bribes in the form of campaign finance from big corporations, and so when they get elected, one hand washes the other, as said politicians will be ultimately beholden to the donors over the constituency. And with the Supreme Court ruling over Citizens United that spending money on politicians is the equivalent to free speech, the implications of this means that bribery and pay-to-play corruption are not only legal, but a constitutional right enshrined directly under United States rule of law. Running for governor, or for House, or for Senate, let alone running for president, costs an absolute fortune, as hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars are needed to be raised by the candidate and their staffing teams in order for them to buy any sort of advertising time on the airwaves, or to finance any sort of on-the-ground organizing. So from the get-go, the political process is pay to play, and if a candidate does not have the money to participate, said candidate will have no valid path towards getting elected. Regular working people have no money. Those who own and possess capital have net worths in the millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions, or even billions of dollars, and will by design have all the money that they will ever need to finance their chosen politicians. So in the end, no matter what any politician's stated agenda might be, no matter what they may tell the people who are voting for them, what they are going to do for them once they're elected, because of who is writing their campaign checks, at the end of the day, it is ultimately the needs of the wealthy and powerful that they are going to put first and foremost and concern themselves with, as our elected representatives are under no legal obligation to fight for us or uphold any of the promises which they may have made to their constituency on the campaign trail. And even if you were to put up a left-wing working-class representative in an election, even if the progressive candidate does manage to raise all the money that they need, if they're pushing for an agenda that is too far to the left for the oligarchy's liking, if that candidate were to, say, be running primarily on small campaign contributions and eschewing dark money oligarch financing, then that candidate will be blackballed by the mainstream media. They will be treated like they're a complete joke or an active hostile threat to the American dream. That is, if they're even given any sort of media attention in the first place. At the same time, The oligarchy will pump additional money into financing the progressive candidates' competition in an effort to outspend them on campaign advertising and drowning the opposition in the media. Just look at the way that Bernie Sanders was treated during both the 2016 and 2020 Democratic primaries. Sanders has been the victim of non-stop red baiting by both Democratic and Republican partisans alike. I remember seeing a story that Bloomberg ran 25 negative articles covering Sanders in a 24-hour time period. Or the conservative anti-Bernie Sanders attack ads being ran in Iowa prior to the 2016 Democratic primary.
Senator Bernie Sanders has some very big plans. Bernie wants to provide free college for our young people. No tuition, completely free. Now Bernie's doubling down with Medicare for all, which is basically single-payer, government-sponsored health care. No big insurance companies, just more government spending, paid for by raising taxes on Wall Street, big business, and the super rich.
As though free healthcare and college are supposed to be an inherently bad thing. And then there's my favorite little compilation of airheaded media mouthpieces trying to slander him as a sexist creep.
Me, as, again, I'm not the political analyst here, but just as a woman, probably considered a somewhat moderate Democrat, Bernie Sanders makes my skin crawl, and I can't even identify for you what exactly it is, but I see him as sort of a not pro-woman candidate. Ceiling. There is nowhere to go, but there's no up to go. And all of those, I actually overheard someone saying that I thought was an interesting point, that basically at this point, if you are still supporting Sanders as opposed to Warren, it's kind of showing your sexism, because she has more detailed plans and her plans have evolved. I thought it was an interesting point, and I think there may be something to it.
So in summary, the factionalism that you see between Republicans and Democrats is largely artificial and manufactured. The politics which you see and hear commonly broadcasted on the airwaves are littered with tribalism, faux resistance, cliches, platitudes, pandering, anti-intellectualism, fear-mongering, and brain-dead partisanship, and it's this way by design. Beyond the superficial differences that you see between the two, the political apparatus at large is a highly insular system, and all you have to do is look at the way that they treated Bernie Sanders to get an idea of what kind of wanton hostility and ratfuckery that an actual third-party working-class threat will receive when an actual alternative has been built up and has the support and money that it needs to challenge the status quo. I think George Carlin put it best.
I'm talking about the real owners now. The big, the wealthy, the real owners, the big wealthy business interests that control things and make all the important decisions. Forget the politicians. They're irrelevant. The politicians are put there to give you the idea that you have freedom of choice. You don't. You have no choice. You have owners. They own you. They own everything. They own all the important land. They own and control the corporations. They've long since bought and paid for the Senate, the Congress, the state houses, the city halls. They got the judges in their back pockets, and they own all the big all the big media companies. So they control just about all of the news and information you get to hear. They got you by the balls.
In the face of the mounting evidence presented thus far, there are two conclusions which are commonly derived. The first one being the naive liberal conclusion, which is that the system is merely damaged and or broken, and that it merely needs to be patched or fixed. And if we could just pass a few key reforms here, get a few people elected there, we could succeed in reconciling the mounting contradictions threatening human life as we know it. The Kyle Kalinskys and Sam Cedars of the world come to mind when I think of such naive individuals. The second conclusion, the revolutionary conclusion, is the realization that the system isn't broken at all, that the system is actually working just as intended, just as the Founding Fathers intended in fact, and that from its foundational roots it is this way by design. None of the laws that are in place, from the legal barriers erected to cockblock and ratfuck left-wing political candidates, to the insular system of legalized bribery, to the autocratic Supreme Court that can shut down popular legislation at will, to the privately owned media used to manipulate the general public, to the unelected, unaccountable, legalized criminal gangs such as the FBI and the CIA, none of this is by accident. All of it constitutes a grander design by the ruling class in a nefarious effort to deliberately conspire against the public as to further their own class interests. And what are said class interests? Maximizing private enrichment and accumulation. It's nothing more than the rationale of capitalism taken to its logical conclusion. Why is it that buying and selling politicians is any different from buying and selling pizzas? Why is one of these things considered ethical while the other is not? If I'm a billionaire and I can secure 3% growth in the second quarter, and all I have to do is destabilize half a continent via CIA meddling and US military adventurism, directly plunging millions into poverty and fueling the coming refugee crisis, why would I not push for that exact agenda if it serves my own self-interest? If I can avoid paying millions upon millions of dollars in taxes by offshoring my bank accounts, why would I not do that? And if I'm a wealthy, white, slave-owning, property-owning, semi-feudal baron from the 1700s, why would I not set about building a nation with a political system carefully constructed as to put my class interests at the forefront before everything and everybody else? All of the so-called corruption is merely part of capitalism's built-in logic, and that it is the likes of Kalinsky and Cedar that are the ones being naive and inconsistent in their desire to make a more socially aware and humanist capitalism. As far as I'm concerned, while we're operating under capitalist logic, we may as well let the rich own and control everything. We may as well declare Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos the permanent god emperors of mankind and let them rule by decree till the end of time, if we were going to be logically consistent liberals here. And it is for these reasons that we need to build a working-class alternative to the status quo. We need a vanguard, we need unions, we need militias, we need third-party politics, working-class news media, working-class cultural censors. We need to devote our time and effort into doing actual class struggle and building up these alternatives. Do you want a more socially conscious, humanist, socioeconomic mode which puts people, planet, and peace before profits? Then what you're really asking for is socialism, and it's about time we start fighting for it. In the next couple of video essays in this series, I plan on covering in detail how exactly the 2016 Democratic primary was rigged, and in the video after that, I shall be overviewing the inherently fascistic nature and tendencies of the freest country on earth. Stay tuned, comrades. More deep contents to come.